Hi there. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you very much to the organizers for putting together this wonderful event. And thank you for putting me first in this symposium, because now there's at least a chance that I can pay attention to the other exciting talks. It's just so hard to focus otherwise. Okay, I have a message for you today. It has to do with how our ancestors competed for and chose mates and how that shaped our present selves. And also, toward the end, I want to talk a little bit about some social implications, some implications for social equality, but more on that later. In my lab, we study the evolution and development of sex differences, and of all the many psychological, behavioral, anatomical, physiological traits that I could choose to talk to you about today, I picked just one: voice pitch, because why not? And also because it illustrates some important points that I want to make about the evolution of human mating. Now, here we go. Voice pitch is measured by fundamental frequency. This is the acoustic parameter closest to what we perceive as pitch. Pitch is the most salient acoustic feature of speech, and fundamental frequency is just the rate of vocal fold vibration during phonation. When we push air past our vocal folds when we speak, they vibrate at a certain number of cycles per second, or hertz. That's fundamental frequency. And that's what we perceive that as pitch. Now, there's a sex difference. Women tend to vocalize at about twice the fundamental frequency of men, and that is true regardless of society or culture. There's a little bit of anthropological flavor for you there. And the sex difference is very large, more than 5 standard deviations, so that there's very little overlap between the sexes. In fact, in this sample of over 600 young adult young men and women, there was no overlap. The highest pitched guy's voice was lower in fundamental frequency than the lowest pitched woman's voice. And this is one of the largest secondary, in terms of sex differences, the most sexually dimorphic secondary sex traits in humans. So as you may know, there's a large sex difference in physical aggression, depending on how it's measured, around a standard deviation. Of course, waist to hip ratio, WHR, sexually dimorphic women have a more narrow waist than hips, and men are more cylindrical. Men are heavier, have bigger biceps, taller, stronger hand strength, but all of these sex differences are small in comparison to the sex difference in fundamental frequency. As a matter of fact, these are data that I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about throughout the talk. Non-human primates, we are the most sexually dimorphic ape. So these are, let's see, there's got a pointer here. These are gibbons and siamings, not very sexually dimorphic at all. Orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees were the most dimorphic. Well, we know the proximate causes, that is the developmental causes for this sex difference, pretty well. At puberty in males, testosterone levels go way up. Testosterone binds to androgen receptors in the vocal folds, affecting gene transcription, and that causes the vocal folds to get longer and thicker. And long, thick vocal folds vibrate more slowly, the way that the strings on a piano that are longer and thicker vibrate more slowly, producing what we perceive as a lower pitch. But why did we evolve such a very large sex difference in a mode of communication that both sexes use equally? Doesn't that strike you as bizarre? Why did we evolve to respond to testosterone in this way, so that our vocal folds, of all things, get big? So that's going to be the bulk of my talk. And the first hypothesis is that it's a functionalist byproduct of the fact that men are bigger. Men are larger, so they should have longer, thicker vocal folds, right? This is a plausible hypothesis, but it's not correct. And we know this for several reasons. First of all, the sex differences in acoustic and vocal anatomy are way out of proportion with the sex difference in size. So men are, on average, across society, 7 or 8% taller than women, so their vocal folds should be 7 or 8% longer, right? But they're not. They're 60% longer, almost an order of magnitude more sexually dimorphic than the sex difference in body size. Also, within sex, size doesn't correlate very well at all to voice pitch. And most importantly, when you statistically control for body size, the magnitude of the sex difference in fundamental frequency is almost undiminished. It's still very large. Well, another hypothesis is what's been called phylogenetic inertia. And this is just the idea that we inherited from an ancestral species this sex difference in fundamental frequency, but it hasn't evolved specifically in our own species. And this hypothesis is belied by recent data. Actually, one of my recent graduate students, Alex Hill, collected, to our knowledge, the largest compilation of non-human primate vocalizations of known sex in the world, and he picked the 2,000 very best of those, and he measured them all, fundamental frequency on all of them, and then using the sexual dimorphism in modern primates, we can infer ancestral states, and so that's what we did. So a lower value here, this is male fundamental frequency over female, so a lower value means more sexually dimorphic, and what you can see is that there's a monotonic trend toward increasing dimorphism in our lineage from the ancestor of all the apes, gets smaller, to the ancestor of the great apes, to the ancestor of African apes, to our common ancestor with chimpanzees, to modern humans, more and more dimorphic as you go along. So, we probably don't exhibit this sex difference just because we inherited it from an ancestral species. It looks like there's been selection specifically in our own lineage. In contrast, there is abundant evidence for a role of sexual selection in shaping sexual dimorphism in pitch and fundamental frequency. And just to remind you, sexual selection is the kind of natural selection that favors traits that win mating opportunities, and there, as opposed to, say, avoiding predators or caring for offspring. And there are multiple modes of competition for mates, or so-called mechanisms of sexual selection. And I want to focus on the two most salient for vocalization: contest competition and mate choice. Contest competition is the use of force or threat of force to exclude same-sex competitors from mating opportunities. And it favors traits like size, strength, aggression, weapons, threat displays. And mate choice is just what it sounds like. Favors sexual displays, sexual ornaments, other behavioral and anatomical traits for attracting mates. So here is a male superb bird of paradise in the background, and a female in the foreground. The male's got his feathers stuck out like this, and he's doing a little dance like this for the female to try to potentially woo her. So what mechanism of sexual selection is illustrated here? Anyone? Yes? Mate choice. Very good. Okay. And you didn't know there was going to be a quiz. And here are two male gorillas. This is one reason why you don't put adult male gorillas in the same enclosure in a zoo. Remind anyone of American football? So what mechanism of selection is illustrated here? Go ahead. You got them all today. The first, contest competition. Okay, very good. Now I ask you that not just to check whether you were paying attention, but also to make the point that we can infer ancestral selection pressures by examining the traits that those selection pressures produce. Form follows function. So we can ask ourselves, what does male or female fundamental frequency in humans look like it's been designed for some function? If so, which sex and which mechanism? So we need to look for evidence of functional design. Well, the cross-species analysis of some of the data that I just showed you on non-human primate vocalizations indicates that sexual selection has shaped sex differences in fundamental frequency across anthropoid primates. So these are as you go toward the left, more polygynous species. By the way, these results are the same whether you include humans or don't, whether you consider us monogamous or polygynous, but we'll talk more about that later. Monogamy this way, and you can see increasing sexual dimorphism in polygynous species and decreasing dimorphism in monogamous species. Now, it would be inappropriate to analyze the data this way because it doesn't take into account phylogeny. Closely related species can resemble one another because they share a recent common ancestor. So, in other words, they're not independent cases. But when you account for evolutionary relatedness using the method of phylogenetically independent contrasts, we see that evolutionary transitions toward increasing polygyny. By the way, both of these analyses are including as a covariate the sex difference in body size. Tendencies toward increasing polygyny are associated with greater sexual dimorphism and fundamental frequency, and the evolution of greater monogamy is associated with the evolution of lower sexual dimorphism. Now, these data not only strongly suggest, I would say, the influence of sexual selection, because sexual selection is more intense in polygynous species than in monogamous ones, but he specifically suggests that what we're talking about is sexual selection on males, because sexual selection on males is more intense in polygynous species than in monogamous ones. However, it's also possible that sexual selection on women has contributed to the human sex difference. In particular, male preferences for a higher pitch, higher fundamental frequency might have contributed to the sex difference that we see in humans. And there's lots of evidence that men's preferences may have shaped women's acoustic characteristics. For example, we've found that men prefer the voices of women who are close to the maximal age of sort of peak fertility. These are Hadza women. These are foragers from Tanzania. And of course, across the ovulatory cycle, ovarian hormones are directly related to fertility, in particular estradiol and progesterone. And what we've found is that men prefer female voices when the woman has higher estradiol levels and lower progesterone levels, which also corresponds to peak fertility in the cycle. These are within subjects, within female data for over 200 women. But these relationships are not mediated by fundamental frequency. And while experimental studies such as this one show that if you artificially raise a female fundamental frequency or lower female fundamental frequency, men prefer female voices that are higher in pitch. When we look at unmanipulated voices, and these are recent data on a large sample, and other acoustic parameters are free to vary naturally and simultaneously, what we see is that fundamental frequency does not have a big effect. And this suggests, first of all, perhaps a note of caution about getting too excited about experimental results, because when you manipulate something, you can get an effect. Sometimes participants can even sort of divine the correct answer. But the effect of fundamental frequency on women's vocal attractiveness to men doesn't appear to be very large in contrast, when there's a background of other acoustic parameters varying simultaneously. Okay. In contrast, there is good evidence for an influence of sexual selection on men's voices. And for example, a lower fundamental frequency predicts in one study predicts men's mating success, reproductive success, and women also prefer more masculine voices, lower fundamental frequency and other acoustic parameters. And this is true whether we look at experimental studies or correlational studies. And specifically, women seem to prefer more masculine voices during the fertile part of the ovulatory cycle and for a sexual relationship versus a long-term committed relationship. And this ovulatory phase effect and the mating context effect we predicted beforehand from the idea that that traits that require high levels of androgens like testosterone to produce are honest indicators of heritable immunocompetence, good genes. And that idea was so 2005 because more recent theorizing and evidence suggests that it's both testosterone and the stress hormone cortisol that are related to immune function, the so-called stress-linked immunocompetence handicap hypothesis. It's a mouthful. And that it's the interaction, that traits whose expression depends on the interaction of T and C, of testosterone and cortisol, are most strongly linked to immune function. So we looked and asked the question, do cortisol and testosterone interact in predicting fundamental frequency in men? And we found that they do. We obtained the result that you might expect, which is that higher testosterone levels were associated with lower fundamental frequency. But there was a significant interaction, so that was true only for men whose cortisol levels were low. And we replicated that in a second sample. So these data suggest that a low fundamental frequency may advertise to potential mates and competitors immunocompetence, that is immune function, and perhaps overall condition. So there's good evidence to think that female preferences may have shaped men's fundamental frequency. However, when we look at the effect on dominance, it is much larger. That is, if we test the hypothesis, the alternative hypothesis, that men's voices were shaped more by contest competition than female mate choice, In this particular study, the effect of the same manipulation on vocal masculinity was almost 15 times, in terms of eta squared, almost 15 times the size of the effect on attractiveness to women. And not only does, and this is, we get this effect, but not only does a masculine voice affect people's perceptions of dominance, but the reverse is also true. Men's perceptions of dominance relationships seems to affect how they modulate their voice pitch during a competitive interaction. So this was a study where we had a bunch of guys come in and they were told that they were competing with a guy in another room for a lunch date with a woman in a third room, and we recorded the guys' voices before they did any interaction, and then we recorded them when they were talking to their competitor. And men who rated themselves as less physically dominant than they rated their competitor tended to raise their pitch when talking to him. And men who rated themselves as more physically dominant tended to lower their pitch. So these data are fairly clear that if we ask the question, what does a low fundamental frequency in men appear designed to do, it looks much better designed for intimidating than it does for attracting. And this is a pattern of results that we see with other masculine traits. So basically, any secondary sex trait in men where you manipulate that trait and you look at the effect on dominance and attractiveness, the positive effect on dominance is larger, generally much larger than the effect on attractiveness. So for facial hair, it depends on the public service for the men in the room. Facial hair, in at least one study, decreased attractiveness, but it increases dominance. It makes guys look more dominant. Masculine voices, we talked about facial masculinity, body build. Men's traits, fundamental frequency, and other traits look like they've been designed by an evolutionary history of contest competition, that these are more important for dominance than for attracting mates. Now, we can also make some inferences about our ancestral sexual selection pressures from the fact that sexual dimorphism in fundamental frequency tends to be related to mating system. So, before this talk, where would you put people? Probably, would you maybe think that we're like a monogamous primate, but after this talk, maybe not? You'd be right. Our sex difference in fundamental frequency, we're a little bit more dimorphic than the average polygynous primate, and we're way outside the range of monogamous species. So, these data that I've just talked to you about corroborate data from a variety of other sources suggesting that we have experienced an evolutionary history of moderately strong sexual selection in which our male ancestors competed for mates primarily via contest competition, but also through female choice. And this can also help us understand nonverbal communication more broadly. For example, why we tend to lower our pitch when sort of asserting dominance when making a command. Put that down. Do you want to put something down now when I said that? But why we tend to raise our pitch when we're asking a question, sort of signaling deference. Would you please, do you mind, would it be possible? But there are other real-world implications of these results that I want to talk to you about a little bit. For example, lower fundamental frequency has been found to predict perceptions of respect and leadership, chance of being elected in a hypothetical election, so political candidates' voices were manipulated in pitch up and down, and participants, for both female and male candidates, tended to say that they would vote for the person whose pitch was lower. And this one's scary. Each 1 hertz, that's not very much, 1 hertz decrease in fundamental frequency in men's, and this is almost 800 male chief executive officers for publicly traded companies. Each 1 hertz decrease was associated with a salary increase of $8,500 US per year. Well, I would like to suggest that, as you already know, the fact that women have a voice pitch that's approximately twice that of men's, is it possible that this perceptual bias that we have, attributing a lower fundamental frequency to more authoritativeness, could that unfairly hinder the social, economic, and political prospects of women and some men? And this is not an effect that's unique to voice pitch. Similar kinds of relationships have been seen for height, for facial appearance, for body appearance. So there are many fascinating reasons for studying these sorts of biases and their roles in nonverbal communication. But it may be particularly important for us to study them so that we're aware of these biases, the better to guard against them if we're interested in promoting social equality, and we don't think that signs of physical dominance are a good reason for discriminating on treatment and opportunity. Well, I'd like to thank my collaborators and current and past members of my lab for their many important contributions to this research. And I'd like to thank you all for your kind attention. Thank you.
So what is it that needs to be expressed? I will argue that the first thing we need to know about is what is an emotion, because that is what is expressed. And what of it can be expressed in the sense of providing information to other organisms, because that must be the function. Expression is communication. So if communication is useful, what needs to be communicated? Let me briefly start with the evolution of emotion. So basically, you remember the stickleback, and that's really the instinct. And let me take the example of sweet and bitter. It produces approach or avoidance, and that's a very simple schema matching kind of response. And of course, then the reaction is something like this. And it's universal. We find it in many species, genetically continuous, very nice. But it is very limited because you don't have very much flexibility. So you really want to have a decoupling, and that is where emotion comes in. Emotions have decoupled the SR sequence. How do they do that? Well, clearly, in terms of having flexibility, what you need to do is you need to appraise the stimulus, because schema matching is not going to work anymore. So you need to know, is there something new that's happening to you? Is it good or bad, like sweet or bitter? But then also, can you cope with it? And that's the important addition, that you basically, before you trigger the behavior, you try to evaluate whether you can cope with the consequences. And that then leads to the necessity of preparing reactions that are all possible before they are executed. You have a situational context that will then make a choice among those possibilities. And you only then get the reaction. Okay? Now, social and self-reflexive emotions are even more complicated. You have to add to what we have so far the goal conduciveness, because that is not something that is independent of the individual or the cultural context. You also have to add the norm and self-compatibility. Is it compatible with norms, with my self-image, and so on? And so you get even more action tendencies and more emotions. And that is, for example, the case in shame. So that's where the emotions got to where they are. And the evolutionary advantages are obvious. After you have detected relevant events, there is sufficient time for comprehensive evaluation of the event and the expected consequences. Often, this needs to be done in the absence of sufficient information, because that is very often the case, that we don't know what exactly it all entails. So in most instantaneous preparation of synchronized response organization, in the service of these adaptive actions, delaying the decision is a central issue. And during the delay, what you can do is you can signal your reaction. So we have a continuous multimodal signaling of reactions and intentions to the social environment before any kind of behavior is emitted. And what I will argue is that that is the essential advantage of human emotions, or mammalian emotions in general, that it avoids, for example, in the case of dominance fights, as we have seen in the first talk, something that's very important, we avoid killing each other immediately because we have other means of settling the dispute, the contest. But in order to do that, we need to communicate our emotions. And the issue then becomes, well, what exactly needs to get across? And that is part also of the issue of emotional regulation, because in some sense, that is an input into the communication of emotion. But we won't talk about that today. Okay, I very quickly show you the model that I prefer because it's my own, very simple. So you have an event that produces multi-level appraisals on all sorts of levels, including very low amygdaloid evaluation. These appraisals lead to motivational changes, action tendencies, and they are, of course, underpinned by physiological responses and motor expressions. And we come back to the expressions, of course, in a moment. These changes are then centrally represented, producing what we call qualia, and in some cases, they are then categorized and labeled. Allow me a very quick aside. Yes, we can give a name to the emotion we experience, but we must not, and often we do not. Emotions are not necessarily verbal. It's an add-on, if you will. So psychological constructivism, or simple nominalism, conceptualism, I would just call it fuzzy set categorization and labeling, and we don't need it. We often do it, but if we were to rely on it exclusively, why wouldn't expression be limited to the verbal communication of emotion? Since we have developed this beautiful tool, language, it would be perfectly fine just to say what you feel and that's it. But that is not it. My central point will be that what we need to do is to produce an honest signal of emotion, and that has to be done without that fuzzy categorization and labeling. My thesis advisor, Roger Brown, once wrote a very famous paper, What Shall a Thing Be Called? And he already pointed out that there are many different ways of calling it something, and many different considerations, but he would never have called it constructivism. And what is even worse is to say emotions are conceived in a conceptual act. I don't think that's true. Categorization labeling is the last and least important stage of the whole process. So what happens? Here is a situation that happened recently. As you know, the Swiss franc was reevaluated, 20% loss from one day to the other. It was a shock, very relevant for many people, and quite unusual. The implications were very tough. Many people can't pay back their loans, those who took it in Swiss francs. It will have struck goals. Many people can't cope with it because the earnings, of course, are the same. And there is an issue of the normative significance in terms of the fairness of it all and the fairness of our financial systems. But that's yet another story. So what happens is you have this complete recursive system of reevaluation. You have changes in various components. I won't detail this because we don't have time. But the important thing is that the complete process of appraisal and the preparation of these adaptive action tendencies are being or have repercussions in many different components. And of course, the more complete these kinds of repercussions can be communicated to another organism, the more information you have about the reaction of the individual and the potential consequences in terms of the individual's actions. So, why is there an expressive component in the components I showed you? Well, the first reason is that in addition to the autonomic nervous system, as Bea has shown just a moment ago, the somatic nervous system, the muscles, are strongly involved in behavior preparation. And of course, this muscle innervation is partly visible. The tenseness, for example, but also facial muscles, bodily postures, and so on. So some preparatory actions will be carried out immediately, especially information gathering. Darwin has, of course, claimed that our expressions are really rudiments of formal functional movements. In fact, there was a very nice talk by the Anderson Group, by Lee, on the first day, who showed to what extent the kind of eye musculature plays a major role in differentiation, in discrimination and in sensitivity, with fear and surprise, of course, really requiring large eye-opening, as Darwin had proposed, and other kinds of emotions require different kinds of information treatment. So all this is then shown in the face mostly, but also in other parts of the body. So the dynamic multimodal readout of situation evaluation, bodily reactions, and action intentions provides important signals to the social environment, allowing warning or advertising of interesting stimuli. Don't eat that, it's terrible, or even you might die, or this really tastes good, and go after it. And also the settling of conflict, as I said before. That's a fascinating issue with the biologist, ethologist Zahavi, for example, showing that in dominance fights, a very slight relaxation in one of the contenders will be a signal of who will win the fight. So it's a very interesting and very complex system. So in an evolutionary scale, this signaling utility of emotion expression was probably the primary driving force for the evolution of emotional expression and communication. It's my argument. And I will try to convince you that affect bursts play a major role in this. I define affect bursts as sudden, full-blown displays of emotions in response to highly affective, charged events, very eruptive in different kinds of components. And rather than going on about it, I'll show you some nice affect bursts. Now that's a real nice one. Yeah? So it's eruptive, it's very fast, but then it's over. Now look at this one.
No mistakes whatsoever. Answer my question! The question, jerk!
Okay. So here it's also very spontaneous, eruptive, but it continues on. So there is regulation, and then it comes back up. But it would still, I think, be considered as really bursting out. Now, what about this one?
One person's hands, not the American way. These damn bills that come out here all the damn time, come out here at the last second, and I gotta try to figure out how to vote for my people. I'm sick of it. Every year, we give power to one person.
Very
Now
high.
we pass rules that stop.
Okay. Very high pitch, huh, David? No? Here, I could go on a little bit, because he goes on, it becomes doubtful whether it's still an affect burst or whether it is engineered. Because what the television speaker comments after this is to say, well, this really had an impact on the House, you know? And so it might well be rather a strategic move. Now here is one that is particularly
Alors laissez de côté vos tribunaux, les démarches des parents qui en ont assez déjà de leur souffrance et d'avoir vu leurs enfants ne pas pouvoir être inscrits lors des rentrées scolaires pendant lesquelles vous étiez au gouvernement. Laissez cela de côté, parce que la façon, là, dont vous venez faire de l'immoralité politique par rapport à une politique qui a été détruite et à laquelle je tenais particulièrement, parce que je sais à quel point cela soulageait les parents de voir leurs enfants accueillis à l'école. Et c'est vous qui avez cassé cette politique-là. Et aujourd'hui, vous venez de promettre comme ça, en disant aux parents, vous allez aller devant les tribunaux.
Okay, she said she was very angry. And that was, in fact, commented upon by the press, saying, was that really anger? Well, it wasn't, I think. So here you have a very nice case of a dishonest signal. It was not an honest signal, it was not an affect burst. And she said verbally, I'm angry. But she said it in a way that made it clear she wasn't really. Now, we don't have time to talk about why. The issue is, why do we express our emotions in honest way, as an honest signal? So we need information about the other's event evaluation. It has to be complete and truthful. Completeness, I think, is assured by having as many components of the emotional response as possible, as I said before, because then you get complete information and you can form really a direct impression of what is going on. So in order to guarantee truthfulness, you have this honest and authentic signal, and it has to be spontaneous, and I will argue it has to be synchronized. The components have to be synchronized. In the case of Ségolène Royal debating Sarkozy, it was not at all synchronized. We did an analysis of the tape, and we could show how dissynchronized it was. The sociobiology version of this is that in fact, what we developed is deceptive signals from the beginning. I think that's wrong. I think we first had the honest, spontaneous signals, the affect bursts, and then they are being used by a strategic device for various kinds of purposes, trying to mimic the characteristics of affect bursts. Now, how can we test these assumptions? And I'll be very brief going through some studies that we've done. We can look at production and perception. So one thing is to do the usual kind of emotion induction in the lab and showing the effect it has on expression. So here is the muscle activity over the zygomaticus region in a win-lose situation where people win money. And as one would expect, I won't even show you this up there. Well, very rapidly, you see that the zygomaticus gets activated when you win, as we might expect. Here is odor. We can show in the face novelty. We can show the intrinsic pleasantness of the pleasant odors, again, in this case, the frontalis activity. Here is work that Cornelia Gensch has done, who's here, where we can show that the effect in the EEG in the FRN pattern will have a direct effect, I argue causally, as you may note, on the frontalis muscle in the EMG. P300 in the EEG will have an effect on the corrugator, and here we have P300 on effects on the cheek region, on zygomaticus. And Cornelia can also show the synchrony between ERPs and EMG, but that's work in progress. We're trying to find the best way of really demonstrating these synchronous effects. Another aspect is to try to determine to what extent we can read this information from a face. So in response to a paper by Yeek and Russell, who claimed that the face doesn't express emotion, the face expresses signals, like the claim by Fridland. And what we showed is that the face does show signals, that the face shows action tendencies, as Nico Freida has argued, and that the face shows appraisal. And the results show that appraisals actually are almost as good as emotion judgments. Emotion judgments clearly are the best because they integrate all the rest, if you will. Here is dynamic study of emotion expression that we have done, the GEMAP corpus that is publicly available for research. And in another study with Clark Polner, Schumann, Meulemann, we have shown to what extent we can replicate these results. I won't get into the details, but it's clear, I think, that we can show that the facial expression is interpreted in terms of appraisals, action tendencies, signaling or messages, and of course emotions, because emotions really bring everything together. The same is true for the voice. Here's work by Petri Lauka and Hilary Anger-Elfenbein showing a similar thing for the voice very recently. And Mark Mehu used this corpus also to show very nicely to what extent people can actually judge the major dimensions underlying the emotional expression, so valence, for example, and arousal, based on the facial action units that we had coded in the GEMAB corpus. So you have the distal part and you have the proximal part, and it works very nicely for valence and arousal. As you can see, the action units that are being used by the actors are actually used for inference. Where it does not work, and that's the red parts, is for potency or power. So people seem to have a little bit of a problem reading that correctly from the face. Okay, here is, and at the end of what I will be showing you, a current research program with Ilaria Sergi, who is here and who has a poster. You can go look at more detail tomorrow. Ben Meuleman and several other people, because it's complex research. The question is, how reliably can judges perceive appraisals from facial expression, like what I showed before, and which facial actions are associated with the inference of specific appraisals? And then also, to what extent does this correspond to the predictions that the model that I presented to you make? Because the model comes with a complete set of predictions for face, voice, and body in terms of what should be involved in the expression of certain components. Okay, so here is the method. What we use is a synthetic avatar emotion expression, facial emotion expression program system, FaxGen, that we developed in Geneva. And for example, in this case, you see the action unit 1 plus 2 plus 5 plus 26. In this case, you have 4 and 7. Maybe I do it again. Okay, and here, okay. And then here you have a more complex case. Again. So according to predictions, we produced these action units and action unit combinations synthetically, and then asked people to look at this and in fact decide on what kind of appraisal would be going through the head of the person who is shown as an avatar there. And in terms of results, what we find is very high inter-rater agreement, ranging between by 0.75 to mostly about 0.90. Systematic variation of appraisal ratings across the action units, so there is differentiation, although valence has a very powerful role, and we did the analysis by partialing out valence to get more finely discriminated results, which works well. And you can see, for example, here to what extent the action unit combination 1 plus 2 plus 5 plus 26 is seen as very important for novelty. Now, the current study we're doing, and I got the data that I will report here just on Tuesday, is little more complex in the sense that, first of all, we decided to put hair on these avatars because some people are not happy with these hairless avatars, and also use a context background to make it a bit more realistic. Also, we sold this as a thought reading experiment. So we told people that these are real people, and just so you can't recognize them, we turned them into avatars, but they showed these movements that you will see as synthetic renderings. And your task is to see to what extent you can really read what goes through these people's mind. So here you have the design, very simple. People just look at these movements and then they decide on a slider whether, for example, it's novel or predictable, familiar, etc., whether it's powerless, powerful, whether it's positive or negative, using two aspects, both intrinsic pleasantness and goal conduciveness and goal obstructiveness. We find very similar reliabilities between about 70 and 0.90. Only power is fairly low. Everything else is about 0.90. As I say, power seems to be something that people have trouble isolating from the face. In fact, my claim is that power is in the voice. This is not really part of the talk, but we can show that you really have a little bit like Beatrice's argument that you read different things from the body and from the face. Even the voice and the face and different aspects of the face are apparently better suited to communicate certain things. The face is really a valence communicator. It doesn't do so well for arousal and for power, but the voice is ideal. For power, obviously, I mean, that follows very nicely David's point at the beginning, and also for arousal. The voice is absolutely ideal to communicate arousal. And that's something that hopefully in the discussion we will come back on. So here is the results. As I said, we got these on Tuesday. These are 150 people in a web experiment using a panel in the United States of nicely controlled age ranges and gender ratio and so on. And just in terms of the major results, you can't see it very well, so I have to tell you, it's Action Unit 1 and 4 is the first one. That was an affect burst. So this is Action Unit 1 and 4. It's much more legible than on the screen. So basically the design is you have neither. And even if you have a totally immobile face, people will give ratings. And it's one of the problems. People do whatever they're not supposed to do, but I think it has to do with the kind of valence they perceive in the avatar, or some of them may actually think, because it's all very quick, that there was a movement, they imagine a movement. So in the future, we will have to control for this, because you could say this is a baseline when there is no movement. This also basically shows where the fact that we always use two action units, sometimes in isolation and then in a combination. So this is action unit 1 is there, is present, but action unit 4 is not present. Action unit 1 is not present, action unit 4 is present, and here both of them are present. And what that allows you to do, this kind of design, is to see for what kind of appraisal dimension a particular action unit is really useful. So for example, in this case, as soon as you have action unit 4, you get the power rating there. So it seems that really action unit 4 is the underlying expressive signal that makes people think that person thinks that he or she is powerful. And that fits with our coding of a lot of material where very often we find 4 as part of anger displays, for example, which would obviously be the emotion where you would expect a lot of power. Now, some results are not very surprising. So you have action unit 12, which is the smile, plus action unit 6, which is Ekman's sort of genuine smile addition, the little creases in the eyebrows, in the eye corners. And here, once you have action unit 12, it's fine, and that is the signal. The action unit 6 doesn't do much by itself, and it doesn't really add very much. Now, that doesn't speak against the notion of genuine smile requiring action unit 6, because we didn't ask for genuineness or non-trustworthiness or faking, and it could well be that we would get that result using that. That's one of the studies that we are about to do. But one of the interesting things is that clearly you can rule out certain appraisals will not be inferred by judges on the basis of certain action units, like 7, for example. But it is also, this is action unit 4 and action unit 7. Again, what is important in the combination is really 4. As soon as you have 4 in this combination, you have power. So this is a way of trying to better understand what the mechanisms are, what some of the signals are. And of course, it's an indirect argument. The argument here is to say, well, if people read this from the face, maybe that is also what is evolutionarily being expressed at this point. And of course, we need more evidence for both parts of the equation, but we're trying to get at it through different means. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to also acknowledge the help of a very large group of collaborators. Unfortunately, I can't show the photos because there were different periods. This is work that extends over a certain period of time. So without them, it would have been impossible, and it would also have been impossible without the grants from the ERC and from the Swiss National Science Foundation. So thank you all very much.
Just to finish off the symposium, I'm going to be talking about the nonverbal communication of status or social rank, and I'll use those terms fairly interchangeably, and in particularly how status is communicated through pride displays. So, as many of you here probably know, this is Tom Brady. He's perhaps the most famous American football player. And in this photo, he is displaying a very particular expansive postural display, right? His arms are outstretched, his hands are in fists, his chest is expanded, and he's doing this in response to the exciting news he just received that his football team, the New England Patriots, won the Super Bowl. Now, of course, we all know that Americans tend to be pretty ostentatious, especially about things like football, but just to make the point that Brady's stance here is not unique to American football heroes, here we see a strikingly similar display from Arjen Robben. This is a famous Dutch footballer, or as we Americans like to say, soccer player. And of course, the displays, these kinds of expansive postural displays are something we see all the time from people who've just had a success, right? Whether it's Usain Bolt having broken the world record for the 100-meter sprint, or Senator John Kerry learning that he won the Democratic nomination for president, or Arnold Schwarzenegger simply being Arnold in the 70s. What all these people are doing in celebrating their success is showing pride. Now, in my prior work, we found that this particular nonverbal expression is reliably recognized as pride, and especially so when it includes a specific set of components. Pride is best recognized when the individual has the head tilted upward, the chest expanded, a slight smile, arms raised above the head with hands and fists, or arms folded and crossed on the chest, or in this akimbo with hands on hips positions. And in all these cases, pride recognition rates tend to be comparable to those typically found for the established Ekman basic emotion expressions like anger, fear, sadness, and so on. We've also found that pride is recognized reliably by children as young as 4 years old, by adolescents with autism spectrum disorders. It's recognized through a quick and efficient cognitive process, suggesting that recognition is fairly automatic. And building on Ekman's work in Papua New Guinea, showing that highly isolated members of the Fora tribe could recognize the basic emotion expressions, we traveled to Burkina Faso, West Africa, to test whether people there could recognize pride. Now, Burkina is actually the third poorest country in the world, and because of the poverty there, the people who live there are incredibly cut off from the rest of the world, and particularly from Western culture. That's true even in urban areas, but we did this research among individuals living in rural areas in mud huts with no electricity or plumbing. They were primarily subsistence farmers practicing traditional animistic religions. They couldn't read or write, all of which means they had extremely minimal exposure to any other culture, suggesting that if they could recognize the pride expression, it's unlikely to be because they somehow learned it through some sort of cross-cultural communication like a Western magazine or television show. And in fact, that's exactly what we found. The mean pride recognition rate in this sample was about 5 times greater than what we would see if participants were simply guessing among the options we gave them. Now, that is a lot lower than what we see among our educated university students in America or Canada, but it's comparable to what we found for all the other emotion expressions within this sample. And these rates, I should say, are also comparable to what Ekman found when he traveled to Papua New Guinea and used the same recognition method that we used here. So these are pretty comparable rates to what you get in these kinds of pre-literate societies. What this suggests, of course, is that the pride expression is cross-culturally recognized. Given the isolation of these participants, it may well be universally recognized. Which means essentially that pride belongs in this special category of emotions that are thought to be universal and perhaps even evolved. And so I think that puts displays like this one from Arjen Robben or Tom Brady in a broader and perhaps even evolutionary context. So the question I want to address in my talk today is, why is this? Why is the pride expression universal? More specifically, why might it be adaptive to show one's pride? Well, the argument that my colleagues and students and I have made consistent with ideas that have been in the literature for some time, is that the pride expression is functional because it helps individuals attain social rank. And specifically, the way that we think this works is if an individual has a success and feels pride in response and then conveys this nonverbal expression that we know is universally recognized as pride, that expression might function to inform others that the individual just had a success and therefore deserves high rank. So if this model is correct, there's a number of questions that sort of need to be addressed to support it, and the studies that I'm going to be telling you about today were designed to do that. So question number one that we need to figure out: does the pride expression in fact reliably occur in response to success? Right, I've shown you anecdotal suggestions that it does. Of course, we all think it does, but that doesn't mean that we know it's sort of a reliable human behavioral tendency in this situation. Question two: if it does occur in response to success, does it in fact communicate to others that this individual just had a success, right? Do people observing the expression actually acquire that knowledge from it? Number three, in communicating success, does the expression also communicate that the individual showing it deserves higher status, right? That is to say, is it a signal of high status? And finally, if it does the expression actually influence status-based decision-making? That is to say, if the expression communicates high status, does it require us or lead us to actually treat people accordingly when we see this expression displayed? Do we treat them as if they deserve higher status? Okay, so question one: is the pride expression reliably displayed in response to success? Well, to address this question, I did a study in which we examined the nonverbal displays shown by individuals experiencing perhaps the most intense success of their lives. These were Olympic athletes participating in the 2004 Olympic Games judo competition. Now, we had photos that were taken by an official Judo Federation photographer who was on the mat with these athletes, basically snapping away from the moment of match completion for about 10 to 15 seconds afterwards, allowing us to have a series of moment-by-moment photos of exactly what behaviors were shown by all these individuals. And what this lets us do is compare the behaviors shown by winners and losers. And we had male and female athletes from 36 different nations, which varied in all the major cultural dimensions that might influence these results. So in other words, perhaps we might think, well, people from collectivistic cultures might be less likely to show pride because we know from cultural psychology research that people from these cultures tend to have more interdependent views of self and to downplay self-enhancing emotions like pride. Or we might think that people who are from cultures that have more traditional religious values might be less likely to show pride because in many traditional religious cultures, pride is sort of considered a sinful emotion. So we can look at these issues. So our first question, of course, was, are pride behaviors reliably displayed in response to success? And sure enough, what we found was that for all of the prototypical components of the pride expression, winners were significantly more likely than losers to show each component. So head tilt back, smiling, arms extended out from the body, arms raised above the head, hands and fists, chest expanded, and torso pushed out. All more likely to be shown among winners compared to losers. Now, there was no moderation by gender or culture, those cultural variables, on these effects. But just to really push the issue, we split the sample up based on where people were from. So using Hofstede's scores, we decided to look only at people who are from cultures or countries that are considered to be fairly high in collectivism, and then only at people from countries that are considered to be fairly high in individualism. And what we found when we did that was a complete replication within both groups. So in other words, looking only at people from highly collectivistic cultures, we see the same pattern. They still show pride in response to success. We get the same thing if we divide the sample up on the basis of Englehart's world values. So this is survival versus self-expression values. As you can see, same pattern in both groups. And we get the same thing if we divide it up on the basis of traditional religious versus more secular rational values. So again, even in those, even among people who are from cultures that are considered to be traditional or hold traditional religious values, they still show pride in response to success. So what this means, of course, is that the pride expression is this cross-cultural behavioral response to success, and that's consistent with this idea that it may be an evolved signal of success and high status. But of course, there's another possibility here, which is that all these people, unlike my Burkinabe participants, have been widely exposed to pride expressions, right? These are people from different countries, but they're professional athletes who interact on a regular basis with people from all over the world. So the reason that they might be showing pride is because they've learned that's what they're supposed to do. That's how one responds to success. So to address this issue, we did another study examining the nonverbal displays shown by people experiencing a very intense success, but this time we looked at people who could not have learned to show pride from watching others. These were blind athletes participating in the Paralympic judo competition. So once again, we had official Judo Federation photos. We compared the behaviors shown by winners and losers, and we had male and female athletes from 20 different nations. But this time we were less concerned with culture and more concerned with another variable, which was blind status, and in particular, whether or not these individuals were born blind. And of course, the reason that we care about that is because if we want to know, or we want to make the claim that people who've never seen pride, in fact, show it, we need to look at people who've never been able to see. So we were able to obtain blind status information for 69% of the sample, and of those individuals, 30% or 12 were congenitally blind. Now, that's obviously a very small sample, but we were fortunate in that just by chance it happened that of those 12 people, 6 were match winners and 6 were match losers. So we could simply compare the behaviors shown by those two groups of 6, knowing, of course, that any effects that emerge have to be particularly strong given the low power of the study. And in fact, what we found was that 4 of the prototypical pride behaviors, so arms raised above the head, hands and fists, chest expanded and torso pushed out, were all shown to a significantly greater extent by winners compared to losers. Now, 2 other behaviors you see here, smiling and arms extended out from the body, clearly are also going in the right direction. We just didn't have enough power to reach significance there. I think the only real difference among this congenitally blind sample is head tilt back. These people don't seem to be showing that component of the pride expression, and I think there might be good reason for this that we can talk about later if there's time. But what these findings suggest is that the pride expression is spontaneously displayed in response to success by individuals across cultures and by the sighted and blind, suggesting that it may in fact be an evolved and innate behavioral response to success. Which gets to the next question we need to ask, which is, in being shown in response to success, does the pride expression in fact communicate an individual's success to others? Now, to figure this out, we didn't want to simply ask people whether they associated or whether someone who was showing pride was likely to have just had a success, because we thought that would sort of pick up on intuitive associations between pride expressions and success. Instead, what we wanted to do was test whether people would use pride displays as if they communicated success. And in particular, what we thought is, if pride communicates success, then people should selectively choose to copy and learn from pride displayers, such that the expression actually biases social learning. Right? We know from prior research that humans are likely to have an evolved preference to copy and learn from social models who are particularly successful in a given domain of interest. Our thinking is that the pride expression may be part of what tells observers who those models are likely to be. And of course, if the pride expression in fact communicates success, then observers would benefit from selectively copying people who show it. So to address this question, we did a study in which we put people in a situation where they had to learn, they had to acquire new knowledge. And we did that by asking them to answer this pretty much impossible trivia question, right? Pi to the 9th decimal place. I'm not going to quiz you guys, but no one knows the answer to this question, even though Pi Day is like tomorrow, I think. And we incentivized them to get it right? So they were told they would get an extra monetary bonus if they got it right. And we then said to them, here's a photo. Imagine this is another participant doing the study with you, okay? And what they didn't know was that she got it wrong. And our question was, will they be more likely to copy her incorrect answer when she shows pride compared to when she shows shame or neutral or happiness? And in fact, that's exactly what we found. Observers were significantly more likely to copy the answer of the pride displayer compared to any of these other emotion expressions. Now, of course, this is good preliminary evidence, but this design was a little bit weird, right? They're told to imagine this is another participant doing the study with them. They know it's just a photo, but we were fortunately able to replicate this study using live social models, so Confederates working for us who posed emotion expressions while answering similarly difficult trivia questions. And as you can see, we got the same pattern, even more strongly so. So again, about the same frequency of people copy the pride displayer. About 80% here copy the answer of the person who showed pride, whereas far fewer people copy the answer of the people showing these other emotion expressions, suggesting that the pride expression does communicate an individual's success and as a result, bias social learning. And that gets to the third question we wanted to ask, which was, in addition to communicating success, does the expression also signal high status? That is, beyond deciding to copy someone who shows pride, do we also come to see him or her as someone who deserves higher rank, someone who should be treated as high status? And our thinking here was that if pride does signal status, it should do it implicitly. And the reason for that is that if pride evolved for this purpose, then perceivers should automatically infer high status for the expression. This is both practical, it simply would be kind of ineffective as a signal if it required a lot of deliberative resources for people to figure out that the person showing pride deserves high status. But also, evolutionarily speaking, our thinking here is that this evolved as a pre-linguistic, pre-conscious form of communication, perhaps from dominance displays shown by other primate species. So, to address this issue, we use the implicit association test, or IAT. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail on this, but basically what we did was we told people to look at two different positions, position A and position B. Position A was always a pride expression. Position B varied. Here it's a shame expression. And then these positions were paired with high or low status words, and we verified that all these words in fact conveyed high or low status. And so participants in this study would be asked in one condition to press the key with their left index finger, so the F key, every time they see a high status word or a position A photo, and then to use their right index finger on the J key every time they saw a low status word or position B photo. And our question was, will these associations be made much more quickly compared to when it's reversed? That is, when now low status words are paired with position A or pride photos, and high status words are paired with position B or shame photos. And in fact, that's exactly what we found. Participants were much faster to associate pride with high status and shame with low status than they were to make the reverse pairings, as you can see with the yellow, the taller bar, which means much slower responding. And what this means is that the pride expression is implicitly associated with high status, or that the shame expression is implicitly associated with low status. We can't really tease apart those two explanations from this study. And of course, shame is a low status emotion, so probably both are actually driving this large difference. But we did a number of follow-up studies to kind of further address this issue, sometimes comparing pride with other emotions that aren't theoretically relevant to status, other times comparing it with emotions that we thought should be linked to high status, like happiness and anger, which of course is a high power emotion. And then sometimes comparing pride to this expression where the guy had his arms extended and kind of was taking up a lot of space. And our thinking there was, well, that's a fairly high power, high status kind of position to hold. But what we found was that no matter what we compared the pride expression with, people were always much faster to associate pride with high status and that comparison thing with low status than they were to make the reverse associations, even though responding quickly in these conditions required them to pair things like anger and happiness with low status, clearly not intuitive associations. Okay, so this is all consistent with the evolutionary argument I've been making, but of course these findings are based on North Americans. Most of this research was done in Canada, and these are Canadian undergrads. So to really test the evolutionary count, it's not enough to know simply that pride signals high status automatically. What we need to do is know that this automatic status signal generalizes across cultures, and ideally across cultures that have minimal contact with each other. And fortunately, we were able to do that by replicating some of these studies on a small island in Fiji known as Yasawa Island. Now, we did this in a little village in Yasawa known as Tethi, and the people there live in pretty much a small-scale traditional society that exists in much the same way as it has for thousands of years. Because they're on this island cut off from the rest of the world, they also have no computers, no television, no electricity, there's no newspaper or mail delivered to the island. All of which means that if these people show the same automatic association between pride displays and high status as we found in our Canadian undergrad sample, it's unlikely to be because they somehow learned it from some sort of cross-cultural communication. So we exported our IAT study to Fiji. We did that simply by bringing laptop computers to this society, and these people had never seen computers before, but we managed to make it work. In part, we did that by recording their responses with these large external buttons that we hooked up to the computer. We thought that people who'd never used a keyboard before might have a hard time responding as quickly as we needed them to for the IAT to work on the keyboard, so we used these external buttons, which worked quite effectively. And in fact, what we found was a complete replication of what we saw among our Canadian undergrads. So as you can see, when we compared pride and shame, people were much faster to associate pride with high status and shame with low status than the reverse. And we got the same thing when we compared pride with neutral expression, suggesting that it's not just about shame, that pride in particular is implicitly associated with high status in this culture. Okay, so the findings I've shown you so far suggest that the pride expression, thinking about it as an implicit status signal, we know it's a spontaneous behavioral response to success, which communicates an individual's success and expertise to others. And we now know it also sends a strong, implicit, automatically perceived message of high status to others, which generalizes across cultures, suggesting that this may be a universal signaling function. But one question I haven't addressed is what happens when contextual information is available? In all the studies that I've told you about so far, people saw these emotion expressions completely devoid of context. And so while it might make sense that when we see a pride expression and know nothing else about the expressor, we infer that they deserve high status, if we know something about them, if we know about the context that tells us whether in fact they deserve high status, it's not clear that the emotion expression will be as impactful. Right? And of course, in everyday life, this is typically how it works. It's pretty unusual to see someone show an emotion expression and not know anything else about them. Much more often, we know something, such as when Arlen Robben shows that pride display, we already know that he just won his game, which makes it questionable what added value the expression is conveying. So to get at this issue, we decided to really put pride to the test and examine whether it has any impact on status perceptions in a situation where we already know from context that the person is low status. And to really kind of push it, we thought, what if we know that the person belongs to the lowest status segment of society? Right? What if we know the person is homeless, which is about as low status as you can get in contemporary Western culture? If this person shows pride, will that expression have any impact on our status perceptions of him? So to address this issue, we did another IIT study, this time comparing the status associations of this person dressed in homeless garb with status associations of this same person now dressed in business suit garb. And we thought this is a low versus high status manipulation. And so the first thing we did was just compare the status associations, the automatic status associations of these guys when they showed neutral emotion expressions. And sure enough, what we found is there was this massive effect. This is, I guess, about as big as the gender difference in vocal pitch. So it's a really big difference. And not surprising, right? People are much faster to associate the businessman with high status and the homeless man with low status than the reverse. But of course, what we want to know is what happens when these guys show emotion expressions that are incongruent with the contextually indicated status level. Well, what we find is these two new bars here are not significantly different from each other, meaning that huge effect is entirely dissipated. So in other words, and I should say also, this condition where the emotion expressions are shown is significantly different and quite large from the other condition where they show neutral expressions. So in other words, what this means is it's not the case that the emotion expressions make the contextual status information irrelevant. Instead, what it means is that these emotion expressions are equally powerful to that very powerful status information. Or to put it more bluntly, displaying pride can make a homeless man automatically perceived as equally high in status as a businessman who had a bad day. Okay, so the pride expression as a status signal is automatic, it's unique to pride, it generalizes across diverse cultures, and it's strong enough to overpower competing contextual information. And that gets to the last question I wanted to address, which is, in conveying high status, does the expression also influence status-based decisions? Right? These are decisions that we make every day in which we take into account someone's status, something like who we want to work with, who we want to hire, who we want to vote for. But in all these cases, when we make these decisions, we typically do so using deliberation, right? We don't automatically decide these kinds of real-world important things. And so what's not clear is whether our automatic judgments that come from the pride expression come into play when we actually have time to deliberate and think about these kinds of decisions. So to address this question, we did a study in which we told people that it was their job to decide who to hire for the position of bank manager. And we thought this was a fairly high status position. And we showed them the resume of one of the candidates who was applying. Now what they didn't know is that there were two resume conditions. So some people saw this good resume condition. So here, the candidate has an honors degree from one of the best universities in Canada, and again, these are Canadian undergrads, the participants. She did really well at this university. She also did well in high school. She's got a lot of impressive extracurriculars, and she's fluent in French, which Canadians think is like really great. Other participants, however, saw this bad resume condition. Here, the candidate has a degree from a local community college, and she didn't do all that well there. She also didn't do that great in high school. She doesn't have a lot of extracurrics, and she only knows a bit of French. So clear difference between the resumes in terms of who's the more competent and qualified candidate. But that's not the only information that participants were given. They were also shown a video clip from an interview taken with these candidates. So some people saw this interview clip. And here what you see is the candidate answering questions about her qualifications and why she wants the job. Throughout it all, she's showing the pride expression. Other participants, however, saw this video clip. Here we have the same individual. She's obviously a Confederate working for us. She says the same thing. She's memorized the script. But this time, throughout the entire interview, she's showing shame. And so our question is, what will influence that decision of who to hire? Will people decide who to hire on the basis of the resumes, which had a clear difference in terms of who was more qualified and competent? Or will they go on the basis of the emotion expression shown in the videos? So we didn't only ask them who they would hire, we also asked them to make a few judgments about these candidates. The first thing we asked was just how high in status are each of these people? And consistent with most of the other findings I've shown you in this talk, we found that status judgments were based almost entirely on the emotion expression shown in those videos. Right? So people who showed pride in the video were considered to be much higher in status than people who showed shame, regardless of their resume. Right? A little surprising that bad resume doesn't actually lower status judgments, but it didn't. Really, there's only a main effect of the video. Now this, of course, could mean that participants simply weren't reading the resume, which would be problematic, but fortunately we also asked participants to make judgments about how smart the candidates were, and there we saw the opposite pattern. Here, the videos don't matter at all, emotion expression had no effect on intelligence judgments, only the resume did. So the candidate with the good resume was judged to be significantly smarter than the candidate with the bad resume. Okay, the big question though is hiring. Will the decision of who to hire be based on the status perceptions that seem to be coming from the pride and shame expressions in the interview, or will they be based on this judgment of intelligence or competence that's coming much more from the resume? Well, as you can see, what we found was there was actually no effect of resume on hiring. That decision of who to hire was based entirely on the emotion expression shown in the video, such that the candidate who showed pride was more likely to be hired than the candidate who showed shame, regardless of how good or bad her resume was. Okay, so to sum up what I've told you about today, we found that the pride expression is this spontaneous behavioral response to success, which communicates an individual's success and high status to others, implicitly, across cultures, powerfully enough to override competing contextual information, and powerfully enough to shape real-world decision-making and actually also to influence copying behavior, suggesting that the pride expression is a persuasive message. All of which suggests that the expression may in fact have evolved to promote high rank. And I think that explains why we see these kinds of nonverbal displays in these situations. Even though everyone might already know from the context what happened, by showing these expressions, what these individuals are doing is ensuring that they get the message across. And they can't help it, right? It's an evolved signal and it's functional. It tells others that they deserve a status boost after their success. Okay, thank you for your attention, and thanks for my students and collaborators and sources of funding.
I was, of course, fascinated by the findings and also interested because of the emotion expression of anger, where in the voice what we find is this intriguing difference that fundamental frequency has to be low and loudness has to be high. Now, of course, physiologically, if loudness increases, F0 also increases. So there must be an intricate kind of modulation of F0 for this anger expression, which is central for the contest. Do you have any explanation for that?
Well, am I on? I can't hear myself.
Can
you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, all right. That's a really good question, and my answer would be based on your work, so you can answer this question as well as I could, but you know, there's this kind of contrast between hot anger and cold anger, right? And so part of our sort of emotional, our vocal response to this emotional change is, I think, a result of emotional activation. And you know, keeping pitch low sort of indicates that you're not flapped in this situation, that you haven't activated your sort of flight or fight response. And so if you're able to keep your pitch low, then that indicates that I don't need to prepare. I mean, you made a comment about being, I think it was your comment about relaxation, that you can sort of predict. If one competitor is able to relax in some way, then that shows I'm not worried. And that, I think a low pitch is sort of like that. And so raising pitch under some circumstances, including the case of the senator flying off the handle, is a sort of indicator of losing control. But I'm potentially dangerous, but not dominant. And you know, raising volume may be something like that as well. But I'd actually be interested in you answering your own question, because this is based, a lot of it is your own research.
I don't know, because I think it's this physiological problem of increasing the subglottal pressure and at the same time regulating pitch. But that's too complicated. Very quick question to Beatrice. You mentioned that there was not so much difference between dynamic and static. I mean, we do find differences though, and you think it's possible that when you have a picture only, basically you get an apex, usually what we do in experiments, an apex of the expression, that then you would tend to more focus on the symbolic significance, and that the brain can do that very well because there are symbolically encoded templates.
You mean when you with the static you have something like an icon which you can. I don't know. I don't know. But the beginning of your question was something different. You started off with a different point I was going to reply to. Can you repeat it?
Well, it's really this issue of whether there is this filling in that you assumed, or whether it is this icon that is being retrieved.
Well, it's one way of answering, and we don't have the very few data have that is a more detailed view of the time course. Because if you look, for example, at MEG and EEG, you see that there is like a very rapid response, even some studies much faster than what I said. So I can't really see how you could dissociate the still from the dynamic information. Now another point is I find all those comparisons of still and dynamic very complicated first of all for a completely trivial reason. There is just more information in a dynamic clip than in a still one. So what we did already was to make sure that the length of the, not just the apex, but the apex, but also that the length of presentation was the same. And that's also a variable. So it depends on what question you want to answer with your study, whether you use this one or the other one. I mean, overall, of course, you're right, but I mean, you get like a 10% increase when you use dynamic versus still, but I don't think that's very important. I mean, that measures something you don't know what you're doing.
I have one brief question for Jessica,
Sound.
and that is there's a related line of research on power gestures. And many of your pictures actually reminded me very much of the power gestures that you see, for example, in Kadi's research, and that is used, by the way, in very interesting contexts like trauma patients. Do you have any hypothesis about the link between pride on one side and power gestures on the other?
Yeah, no, I think my take is that, thank you. My take is that what Kadi and Carney and Jaap are looking at are pride displays, which, as my research shows, convey high power. So I think that there's a link that makes a ton of sense. It makes sense to me that it would be the emotion that's sort of this biological, physiological response to success and other situations, dominance, perhaps victory in an agonistic conflict. And the outcome of it is that you get perceived as high power. And then what their research suggests is that it actually might have these embodiment effects where people feel more powerful. I know there's a study or two showing testosterone boosts, cortisol drops, which is really neat. So my sense is that that's all about embodying the expression. I mean, I think much like facial feedback work, I don't know what the other speakers think about that. It's very neat stuff, really cool findings. I think it's much harder for all of us to explain other than through the process of embodiment. So that I'm not an expert on that, but my guess is that's what's going on there. But.
Excellent, thank you. If you don't mind, we could open the discussion to, and also when you have questions or comments, could you please tell us whether it's for all the speakers or for a specific speaker that you... Yes, that would be wonderful because we can't see anybody here.
So can these lights be turned down and the other lights turned up?
Okay, there should be some mics in the audience. Yes, Brian is there, so you can... Please, we can see much, so if you take care of that, it will be wonderful.
Yes, hello, this is Arvid Kappers. Thank you very much for these interesting presentations, summarizing 60, 70 years of nonverbal research, sometimes with newer methods, but basically pretty traditional. What I was somehow surprised was there was so little communication. Communication was very much implied, but the ongoing communication in a stream of communication, the forth and back synchronization, which actually characterizes apparently the role of when we actually do much of this stuff, I thought was a little bit missing. So starting from social context and Tracy's presentation, I was surprised going back to Kraut and Johnston in the 1970s, where they don't have to do this. We know that it is manipulated by where they are looking, who is present at that moment. The fact that cameras are on people modulates these expressions. We know that. Going to Rainer Krause's research from the 1970s and 80s, who has looked at emerging nonverbal expressions in dialogue, has shown that expressions in dialogue seem to respond more that the opposite person shows emotions most fitting to the tone, to what you are saying. So there's so much in this dynamic thing that actually I had hoped I would hear more about, because if it is only implied by decoupling the presentation, by using synthetic stimuli or actors who do something, having that perceived and maybe looking at responses in the brain captures only so much of what maybe this is all about. I mean, it's not a surprising comment. You know all of this. So this is a question to all, I guess.
Okay, please.
Quickly, Brian, I couldn't agree more, but we are on the verge of overcoming the methodological constraints for that kind of work. Ideally, you would have to not just take into account the context when you show whatever stimulus it is you show to your subjects, but you would actually measure your prime data would be properties of this dynamic loop, as you say. I couldn't agree more, but we have a symposium tomorrow on the use of virtual reality in that context, in which some of the people are on the way to providing new approaches and giving new answers to that. I absolutely agree.
Somebody else want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say I think what my understanding of the Kraut and Johnson work is that having a social context that reinforces these emotions strengthens it. So I think they found that bowlers smiled more. Is this, I think, the study you were talking about? Yeah, bowlers smiled more after returning to their friends who were on their team than right when the strike happened, which I think makes a lot of sense, that when you kind of celebrate these successes with others, it reinforces and perhaps even exaggerates the emotion. But what I would say, and I think this is supported by my data from blind people, is that you don't need that kind of social information for the emotion expression to occur, that it still would occur, but it's amplified by the presence of others, I think. So.
Very quick comment. We didn't choose the title. It's nonverbal expression, really, that we talked about. And we know that, for example, accommodation process is very important, not treated at all. But I think to some extent, even in terms of the nonverbal expression, we're not very far, because it's still the case that people only look at either recognition or at production. And communication involves the expression and the perception and inference. And doing studies in which we actually experiment and not only observe something that's happening in nature to understand the mechanism. So I think we aren't there yet. So that's for the future.
Some other questions? There's somebody here. This is terrible, the light. Yeah, that's terrible.
Thank you very much again. I had a question regarding the high anxiety, low anxiety with the body expression, fixations on the hands. Maybe it went by too fast, but I didn't catch it. But some of the stimuli had a facial expression on the bodies. Some were kind of masked. And so, and the one that I remember was a smile versus a scowl pitted with kind of fighting hands, if you will. And so, can you maybe elaborate on the mechanism,
Sure,
why they're sampling the hands there?
First of all, to clarify, these were a bunch of different experiments, like we started with, as we usually do, with the blanked out faces blank, the inner face blanked out. Okay. Then in the next version, we had, and we found this focus on the hands. You could say, well, okay, that's because there is nothing there inside the face to look at. So then we added the facial expression that goes together with the body expression. And we found the same focus on the hands, even if the information was, you could say, redundant or more directly present in the face. And then we had a third experiment where we said, well, what if there is an incongruent hand posture, hand position, and facial expression? Will they still just look at the hands? So these are 3 different experiments. And in that high anxiety group, there is always a saccading away from the face, contrary to what other groups do, saccading away from the face to get the information about what the other is doing, is up to by saccading on the hands. So that was the situation there.
I think we have still time for a couple of questions. If there's anything. No, if not, I thank all the speakers and the audience, and the continuation tomorrow morning, right? Perfect. Thank you.